Are you a dentist looking to build wealth, maybe create passive income, and be able to eventually step away from the chair? Are there things that you feel like you should or could be doing, but you just don't know where to start? Hi, I'm Jonathan Moffat, a wealth strategist who's built and sold an 8-practice DSO. Now, I help dentists align their practice success with their personal financial freedom. Each week on this podcast, you'll discover strategies to boost your practice profitability, multiply your wealth, and transform your dental career into the lifestyle you've always dreamed of. This is Dental Wealth Multiplier. Hey there, this is Jonathan Moffat. Welcome to another episode, and I have with me the CEO of BlueTree Dental, Steve DeLong. And Steve, we've known each other for several years. I think we originally first met at you were filling in for someone at Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute. I was there, and I remember meeting you, and I remember being on a panel with you, and I remember just being really impressed with how authentic you were and just how kind of leadership centric and focused you were. And it just left a lasting impression on me. I know you've worked with several of our clients, and so welcome to the podcast. I'm really happy to have you on and learn from you and your expertise.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me. And I remember that first interaction. I was actually just in Milwaukee 2 weeks ago visiting with my grandsons, and that was the only time I had been to Milwaukee before that was when we met at that Henry Schein leadership meeting.
You're like, well, April, March, I don't know. For me, you're like still on that like danger window of like going to Milwaukee. It's a little probably still too cold for me, but hopefully you had some good weather.
Well, we walked the zoo and it was a little chilly.
Awesome. So BlueTree Dental, founded in 2011, right? And
yes.
How many practices are you guys at currently right now?
Yeah, we're supporting almost 70 providers and in the high 40 practice locations, pushing 50. So
yeah. That's great. And what type of, maybe just tell us about Blutree. We hear all these, I was just doing a podcast the other day and we were talking about DSOs and kind of the big DSOs, the mid-sized DSOs. Where do you see Blutree? Where does Blutree kind of fit? What have you done as the CEO of Blutree to kind of like stand apart or kind of make say, hey, look, we're kind of a special place where if you're interested in a partner, you should take a serious look at us.
Yeah. Good thing. I appreciate that question. So, we're a multi-specialty group centered mostly in the Western U.S. Our kind of three primary markets are Northern Nevada, Northern California, and then also the Portland, kind of Vancouver, Washington area is kind of where we concentrate probably 95% of our business. We're fairly divided between pediatrics, orthodontics, and general dentistry overall. And, in terms of differentiation, from other organizations, I think it's a difficult, question. When you've seen one group, you've seen one, and we're all a little bit different. And I think that's probably the greatest kind of misnomer for those who are looking to join a group, or whether it's as a provider, partner, or as from an acquisition, whatever the case might be. I think that we've gone through this phase of, people not wanting to join groups. And when they did, they were a bit more, they did a little more due diligence on, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, who's it going to be with? And do I really feel like our values align? And now I feel like there's kind of been a shift in the last few years to kind of like almost resigning that eventually I'm going to have to join a group and, I just need to go with whoever's offering me, the best deal or the greatest amount of money. And I think that goes from an acquisition M&A perspective, even to a provider perspective. So we're seeing, at least in my experience in our group, and we're a mid-sized, maybe what they would call emerging group. I don't try to really label us from a DSO, DPO. I think in essence, they're just people are trying to differentiate the same thing. So like I'm this, but I'd like to differentiate myself as this. And there's an IDSO and a DPO and a DSO. Yeah. In essence, in essence, I don't care. Even if you don't have any private equity, if you have multiple offices and you have some sort of services structure, you've created a support organization. And if your owners are doctors or your owners are private equity, I mean, you have investors, and they all should be wearing an investor hat, whether they also wear a dental mask, during the day. And they should be asking the same questions, whether they are inside or outside of the group. And I think that kind of leads me in, I think, to what's a little unique about Blutree. We didn't set out to start the group at that time period when, at a time period where it was popular. It wasn't at the time, and we didn't even really know what we were doing, and that we were even forming a service organization of any sort, until Mark Cooper said, "You guys are starting an MSO," and we're like, "What's an MSO?" We had saw some groups, we had seen some groups. Some friends of mine had started a pediatric group down in Arizona. 2 providers owned it. And so I knew kind of that there was group dentistry was a thing, and that there were opportunities, and they did pediatrics. And so I got associated with 2 pediatric dentists and 2 orthodontists here in Reno. And I just started to kind of see, where there were some opportunities to expand the business, take advantage of some things. And in that process of starting the business, governance became a real focus of our conversation. And how are we going to structure the organization so that we are properly balancing clinical and business principles, and that we can collaborate with our owner doctors and our future owner doctors and our associates on really establishing kind of those sound principles in the organization. And I think that whether we've been successful or not, I guess that just depends on your perspective. I mean, we've grown pretty steadily. We've had, I would say, below average turnover, for providers and partners for sure. And I think our culture's been strong. I mean, do we have, some challenges here and there? Of course, all groups do, as economics change. But I think it's probably, that's probably one of the biggest, a very transparent, collaborative governance structure that has really kind of yielded some really strong relationships, which have led to a nice social organization. We're not we don't talk, we talk economics, we talk the business because we're in a business. I don't care if you're a private practice, or you're in a group. It's a business that delivers dental care. And sometimes people have a hard time differentiating that. And I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that. And I think our outlook is that we're trying to build a governance that has a long-term outlook. But even then, our governance is changing. The alignment is changing. Of what was necessary 10 years ago to align providers and partners is a little different today. So
that's great. Thanks for giving that. And how do you guys typically structure your deals? Has that changed, over the years, or has it stayed pretty consistent in how you will typically structure a deal?
Yeah, it's evolved. Yeah, I think we started originally kind of in a joint venture structure. So our first several deals were joint ventures with actually just associates who are buying into individual locations or brands. We did a full 100% acquisition early on, where they rolled equity into the holdco, and so we were running parallel kind of a holdco equity model with a very large multi-specialty practice, and then with some joint venture models. And then we kind of ran that parallel for a long time, I would say for 5 or 6 years. And some of our largest partnerships were joint ventures structures before they were, super popular. That's just the way that we did it, some out of necessity, some out of alignment. And we continued down that path. But because we're very partner provider centric, right around that time, 2016, 17, really started to get momentum in group dentistry, and really a lot of events and a lot of conversations about value and equity. And that trickled down into our group, of course, even though that wasn't our primary objective. We were just trying to fill some needs within our marketplace and take advantage of some opportunities. And so that led to a conversation of those who had joint venture equity had a desire to roll that into holdco equity. And so we started that process because we felt like that's what our partners wanted. And so we moved in that direction. And because we were kind of really concentrated regionally, like we could get kind of that kumbaya feeling from that, or, the referrals were moving back and forth and things like that were important. So, and that's the model we followed predominantly up until recently. I would say probably 2 or 3 years ago, we started to shift the mindset of whether or not that model, as we moved into other markets, was providing the necessary alignment that we wanted, but not just what we wanted, but I think what some of our partners wanted over time. And so we had been thinking through it. Then, of course, just between COVID, between the economics and interest rates and things of that nature, we still did some deals that were still 100% acquisitions with holdco rollover. But we have moved to a couple joint venture structures. So I think where we're at right now is that we're looking for alignment like everyone else is, and not just short-term alignment for a recapitalization, but what's a long-term alignment. And I think in order to find long-term alignment, you have to really look deep into your organization's kind of culture and values, as well as you need to ask a lot of questions of your providers and your partners in what they're seeing. So I've gone through that process and got feedback from the vast majority of our provider partners of like, hey, what do you see kind of DSO 2.0 looking like in the future? And how are we going to not just retain, our providers, but how are we going to keep them aligned? And then how are we going to recruit those? And so we've been formulating that structure, and I think it's going to be a combination. But I've also looked at some of the big guys, and they've been around for a long time. And how does Heartland find that alignment? And again, no organization is perfect, but how does Aspen, how does PDS, how does some of these large organizations do it? And, what are some of the fast-growing, super fast-growing ones doing, just purely joint ventures? And is that going to last? So, yeah, we can go to joint ventures, get alignment, but at some point, is that going to run into some challenges in terms of, things? So it's a difficult question to answer, but I would say that we are somewhere in between, in between how we provide that alignment between kind of holdco equity, between joint ventures, to even looking at profit sharing kind of models, that like you've seen a Heartland enter into, where, there's a percentage of profit over a certain, amount. And I think it's going to take all three of those, because what I think the long-term DSO structure has to be is that we have to address provider alignment, strictly provider. We have to have economics of the practice, are they engaged in the P&L, and then overall group economics. So you have to address things at all three levels. Are you being competitive on an individual basis, on a practice basis, on a group basis? And really that's where we are spending a lot of time really thinking and trying to get as much feedback and research as we can, because I think there's a lot of dynamics going on, in the marketplace that I don't think a lot of people are considering, at the time, but at this time. But we're trying to kind of see beyond the next transaction into kind of what is life going to be like for these doctors and our doctor partners and our teams, 15, 20 years down the road.
And so what are some of those things that you're hearing back from your provider partners that they want to see or have, so that you do have that alignment between, the support team, the management team, and the provider team, your doctors?
Yeah. I think that there's nothing I would say was in and of itself was earth-shattering, but I think it was the collection of all the information. And I took all this feedback and all of the kind of the surveying that I was doing in individual conversations. I kind of crunched it through some AI tools. And I just said, okay, here's all this feedback I'm getting. Like, what does it come down to? What are they looking, for? For me, it comes down to kind of economics. It comes down to collaboration, and it comes down to patient care. So I in my spare time I started an executive PhD program, and so don't ask me why. Mainly because that's kind of what I was planning on doing before I kind of got into dentistry, and I've taken like a 15-year kind of side road in dentistry, I almost did it 5 years ago, but COVID kind of derailed it. So I'm in a program, and I spend about 10-12 hours a week, mostly between the hours of about 4:30 in the morning and about 7 a.m. Working and doing research depending on what's going on. So I'm in the early stages of that. But what I initially set out to kind of study was like organizational trust, and how organizational trust can be a differentiator, and how do you develop it? How do you repair it when it's broken? And there's just so much wonderful research. And so I was going down this path, kind of looking back at experiences in dentistry and other businesses, and what it started to lead me down were I'd read something and I'm like, yeah, that's really applicable to what I'm experiencing now, or what I'm seeing, or what I have seen, or what I anticipate happening. And so there's all this great research that really goes unutilized, I think, because it just sits in this academic kind of, pool somewhere. But I started to dig it in, and I got really deep into professional identities, and really, because I started this with 4 doctors. Like, I started this serving 4 doctors, not like, hey, I have this vision of we're going to do this and we're going to grow it and we're going to recapitalize. I was like, hey, what do you guys need? How can I help you? and we talked about their needs. I talked to another guy who had a friend of mine who started a group, and he told me all the challenges he was having just managed as a doctor. And so it really came to be truly a service company. How can I help you? How can I help make your lives a little bit easier? And as I dug more deeper into this professional identity, of really kind of how individuals really align and define themselves within a profession, and really kind of looking at how that pertains to dentistry, and it's led me to governance as well. So spent a lot of time on trying to understand the professional identity, and what's happening in dentistry. And what you can see is that there's not always alignment between governance and preserving professional identity, and there's a disconnect there. And I think that the differentiator in the future is how we're going to be able to marry those things together. How do we preserve, retain, the professional identity of the partners who generate 100% of the income of this organization. I don't generate $1 directly, and so how do we make sure that those things are aligned, and so that's kind of where I'm at in terms of what I'm hearing from them is those 3 areas. Like, it's funny, I did. You can decide to include this or not, but what I was finding, I was doing all this research on professional identity, healthcare, trying to, there's nothing, there's very little research done in dentistry. So I use healthcare, you have to use other professional organizations and things like that. And it's funny, they talk a lot about autonomy, and they talk a lot about these things. And that was a lot of the feedback I was getting from our providers: autonomy, and patient-centric, and kind of these high-value kind of things that you would expect. But then what you don't read about in a lot of the research literature is just the economic aspect of professional identity. And I haven't quite made the full connection, so I don't quote me on any of this information. But what I was realizing is that there is a strong economic component to professional identity that providers went to school expecting, they experienced in private practice. And when they come into this group, into a group setting, that there's a lot of sense making going on, like they were driven to that decision either through, emotions, stress or whatever, or they just seen, and now they're like, well, how do I make sense of this new world that I'm in? And I think that it's not doing, the professional identity of our providers justice. Like it's in all aspects. It's not easy. It's not black and white, but you are seeing, some efforts in that area. But I would say it's economics, it's collaboration, and it's patient care. And if you're not equally, addressing those at each level of the organization, it's really critical, because you're seeing the economics of our business change with interest rates, but also inflation. You're seeing it with, kind of like, what are they calling it now in DSOs? Kind of the big squeeze. Our top line can't really increase because of contracts, dental third payer contracts, but our fees are going up, our costs are going up.
Yeah.
But it's not just costs that are going up and margins that are, feeling pressure. You look at that from a provider perspective who's coming into the group in whatever direction. As if they were an owner of a practice, they were used to a certain level of income, on top of their normal compensation, and then you have. And that's not coming, through perhaps distributions and other mechanisms. And generally in a private practice, I would say 80-90% of the time, what you sell for isn't like, hey, hey, my life is set for, it's, you're sometimes you're talking $1, $2, $3 million, deals. And after taxes, you're going, well, I've been used to making 3, 4, 5, 600. So all of a sudden, the economics, there's this pressure. And so either what do you do with that pressure? Either there's pressure to recapitalize and get your money out and do something different, or to try to make that up. But it's hard to make up that kind of income. So when you're coming out of school, the pressure is, I'm not as productive as the doctors who are senior. Also, I have this huge amount of debt. Also, I'd like to own a house. Like, I have all these things I've created in my mind of what a dentist should have, or a specialist should have. And you're trying to manage that the professional identity that they've created, also kind of the psychological contract that they've created with you as a group, that they're expecting you to be able to address these economics and collaboration and patient care. And when you stop, and when you're not meeting those, then you're breaching that contract, whether you're doing it or not. And it puts you in a position to try to put more controls in place, or you can go the other way. And how do I create more trust within the organization and things? So understanding the economics is really important, and how it's perceived by your doctor partners and associates at the same time. How do we serve them best if we're a service organization? Because I'd give my doctors a hard time. That's not the right term. I'd give my, and I talked to my partners, my doctor partners, and I said very early on, I said, look, I'm never going to ask you to violate a clinical principle. Don't ask me to violate a business principle. And so that allowed us to always have some pretty open dialogue and transparent. And so, at times I would say, hey, you can't, you're treating your team like instruments, to perform. And they would say, what do you mean? And we just have a conversation about, hey, well, they're not instruments, they're people. And there has to be trust there, and they have to grow with you. And this is how we provide leadership. And at times, if the doctors are honest, they could probably say the same thing to the DSO. Hey, we're not instruments,
Yeah.
We're not instruments that you use to produce, and so if, in some ways, it's whether we understand it or believe it or not, it is a collective bargaining relationship that we don't think we've thought through enough times. So,
yeah, it's an interesting
about all that stuff. So,
no, it's interesting, and I think my mind's just racing as you're gonna. I'm like, I want to come back. You talked about trust and how important that is, especially on the support level where you're at, right? You're running a business, right? But you have to have a great relationship with your clinical team because, like you said, they're producing and driving 100% of the revenue for the business to operate. You talked about like having that trust and getting that trust back, and I think a great characteristic of a great leader, or actually a characteristic of a great leader. And I would definitely classify you as a great leader. I mean, I've always been impressed with you and your honesty, your transparency. You're very authentic. And just the fact that you're like, I spend so much time pouring into what's the psychology around like, these doctors and how can we form better relationships at the, with our and support them better. And the fact that you're getting a PhD. I mean, I'm like, man, could you imagine if every CEO or leader of an organization spent that much time pouring into and just focusing on how can we create a better, more symbiotic relationship with our clinical team? Because to your point, and I certainly didn't manage 70, but we had 8 offices, and it was always a conversation, whether it's from the hygienist or the doctor or the assistants, or so usually one of the clinical side was like, all you guys care about is profit. All you guys care about is revenue. All you guys care about, right? And to your point, you're like, and I always believed in a transparent relationship. We always were very transparent with our financials. Like the whole team, we would review the financials on the screen with the entire team. Like, this is what your office is doing, right? Like, this is what's happening. Hey, we want to buy an XYZ equipment. Great. It costs $60,000. We're losing $5,000 a month. How does this economic work, right? So I think part of that, it's trusting. Like, in order to have that transparent relationship, you have to trust your team. I've done a fair amount of speaking. I'll say that. In fact, I just said it in a forum the other day. I'm like, I'm sure a lot of you disagree with me, but I'm a big believer in transparency. We would throw our financials up there. And for me, it was just like, we had that trust with our team. And I was telling them, like, I have nothing to hide from you. Like, these are the numbers, right? But I think that it's such a great characteristic. I think that you have, what makes you such a great leader, one of the reasons why it makes me, I've always, or I should say, I've never had any hesitations referring a client over to you guys who I thought would be a good fit because of that. And I think that's so important. And I would encourage anyone listening to this who's in a leadership capacity, to really think hard about that. There's, again, it's one of those things that trust is earned, not given, right? And again, it's one of those things too, where it's like, just as easily as hard as it's earned, it's easily lost, right? And you got to kind of work back. And I think as your team sees the effort that you put into asking questions, digging into like, how can we better support you? What more can we be doing to be a better support? And the fact, I love that you said, you've kind of have that agreement with them, right? I'm never going to tell you to violate any clinical protocol. You don't, but you can't also. I can't, make me violate any business protocol. And I think those things are so important to have in a successful array, and to have alignment in those relationships. So I think that's great. And I think you dropped some real gems of wisdom there at that last part.
I appreciate that. And I think that, thinking about things and understanding the psychology sometimes is different, than executing, right? And putting the operational processes in place. And I think that that's what requires the collaboration, with your clinical partners, with your administrative team, and really understanding that trust, by definition, there's no trust without vulnerability and without risk. It's not trust if you haven't created a situation where there is some risk involved and there's some vulnerability. And in the end, trustworthiness is really that combination of it's defined differently in academics, but it's from what Stephen Covey would say. He's like, it's really character and competence. And so it's in our integrity and our competence, and then it's also this word in academic, they would use benevolence. So there's like these 3 components of integrity, kind of your competence essentially, and like benevolence. And so you wouldn't use benevolence in normal conversation, but in the end, what does that mean? It's like, well, do people know that you care about them? Like, is the end. Like, are you patient? Are you caring? Are you helping them to grow? Or are you? And in the end, it has to be a mutual. Like, so trust is like we're trying to balance this flow. I'm vulnerable to providers. Providers are vulnerable to me. We're both in risk, and but sometimes we don't really recognize that, and we don't understand. We have to be able to be transparent. I think what you did with your practice was amazing. I think it's something we strive to do as well, and have an explanation of like, hey, we created this vision kind of statement from all this feedback from our providers, and still drafting it. But I was like, this is great. This is a great statement. What we're missing definitions to these words because we're not speaking the same word in the same way. So what does autonomy mean? What does that mean? I don't know. Like, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? And so now we're working through, like, we want to be a leading multi-specialty group in the Western US. Well, what does leading mean? And in what categories? What does it mean from an economics, at an individual level, at a practice level, at a group level? What does leading mean in patient care or patient experience? And now I'm really taking it going, look, we were a very relationship-based organization. And so it really kind of, to be honest, we didn't do as well operationally over time because we brought in great partners who are running great practices. And I'm like, look, I don't need to dig into the operations, and there's just a level of trust. But over time, we didn't maybe find the right balance and didn't develop the right expertise in some of the operational aspects of the practices, and probably didn't address some things as quickly as we can because there was just so much trust. Like, all right, it'll be fine. They've run a great practice. Let's give them room, give them patience. And they probably, were reciprocal in that. So now we're spending time on really defining, well, what does it mean to be leading? Can we agree on that? What's a leading group? If a leading group performs at this level of the economics, and we want to be a top 10%, what does that look like? And then let that flow into the rest of our group. Okay, well, what does that mean at a practice level? What does that mean at an individual level? And so what does it mean to be provider centric? What does it mean to have autonomy? And then again, you're always going to have kind of skeptics in that process. We did that, and I've shared it with all our doctors, and I got anonymous feedback, and one of the feedback was, are you just saying autonomy because you don't want to have accountability, essentially? Like, I want to give you guys more autonomy. Like, and I don't give anybody autonomy. Like, everybody has it, really. I heard Steve Bilt say one time, accountability equals control and influence, and it's totally true. I have a lot of control and influence, but I have to be accountable as well, and to our group. So we're going through this process, and putting that in place and providing definitions and just judge, well, what is it word by word? Is there confusion around, and I'm like, in that situation, I was like, this was your statement. This isn't my I took all of the comments from every one of our partners and put it. I wasn't even using the word autonomy. It was collective. And so sometimes, people are asking for something that they actually don't even want. It's like, well, I don't want autonomy. Then that comes with responsibility.
Right.
I'd rather,
or they heard, right? They're like, listen, I listen to this podcast. They said I should have this, and they don't really know exactly what they're signing up for.
Yeah. So it's been fun, like, to kind of go through that process and look at. There's some great things I've read recently that have provided some, and they're not new ideas, but The Speed of Trust is a great book, but some of the academic research behind it is really good. That was way before that book, and is being done now. And there's a really good book that I had read. It's called Credibility. And it's like the power of expert leadership. And it was done by Amanda Goodall, and she's a professor in England. And she's been focused on developing clinical leadership in hospitals. And she's done research beyond hospitals, but it's like businesses perform better when there's expert leadership, whether it's a bank, whether it's a F1 team, whether it's, a hospital, statistically, historically, the best performing ones have the strongest expert leadership. And I think it's important to think about. And, it's not a book that's going to make your New York Times bestseller. The reason I looked at it is because I've had some communication with her in previous years, because when I was looking at PhD stuff, but I read the book and I was like, I'm going to get this for every one of my doctors, my doctor partners, just because I want them to understand that like my commitment has always been, it's a very parallel structure at every level, and there needs to be, a thing, and it's up to my game. And there's some information on motivation that's really good out there, kind of the SCARF model. I don't know if, you've heard about that, but a guy had done some work. His name's David Rock, and he, it's not new. Like, I think this is back in I can't even remember 2017 or 2006, maybe. I can't even remember. But it was brought to my attention recently, and I was looking at it, and I was looking at the acronym for SCARF and what each one of these things, stood for, and this is, and I started to look at each one of those acronyms, and there's autonomy and relatedness and fairness, and all these different things that if those don't exist, you don't have motivation. Whether you're a doc, and I started to look at that, and I started to compare that kind of at our governance structure, or how we're working as an organization, and I'm like, wow, I think we're violating 60% of those things, or at least not purposefully, it wasn't a priority to make sure that we are focused on certainty. How do you keep people motivated? They want certainty. They want autonomy. They want fairness.
Is it almost like autonomy with oversight, or autonomy with guardrails, right? Because on one hand, you're like, you want the doctors to be free to do and the team members be free to do what they want to do, but also understanding that sometimes that may or may not be aligned with where the company needs, or what is good or better for the whole. I mean, where do you kind of draw that line, or how do you give that feedback of like, hey, we want you to kind of, you've got autonomy, go do your own thing, but right, we have finance partners we have to answer to, other partners we have to answer to, other business, again, that goes back to those business principles you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great point. And one thing that I just want to provide some, I don't know what the right word is, but when I went into this my kind of PhD study, I really wanted to make sure that I was coming from it from a very unbiased, a very neutral position. Yeah, I wasn't like, well, I'm going to go study all these things, how to make these people do more stuff, or so I was like I really wanted to understand, like you said, kind of the psychology of things, and how do I build the governance structure that really elevates the industry? How does it elevate the profession of dentistry? And again, with the knowledge that, hey, I'm just some kid from Fallon, Nevada, that I don't even know how I got to where what I'm doing, but to answer your question, I really have been trying to make sure that, I don't want doctors to be like the subject of an experiment. I don't want my team to be, it's like I'm just trying to understand the dynamics, not trying to manipulate them, in any form. So I just want to provide that clarification. I think that here's what I found to answer your question, and I'm not always concise, as you can see, but is that I heard, I can't remember the name of the CEO for Smile Doctors. I heard him say one time, he had said, there's a framework, but there's freedom in the framework. And I love that statement. Here's where I would add to it, is that as long as the framework is created in collaboration with your clinical partners, I think it can be very effective. And it has been very effective. At least for us, and we continue to elevate it. We didn't really have to. We didn't have a formulary for 12 years. It's only been within the last year. There was a lot of freedom in the framework. Our framework was really wide, and we performed really well. And we didn't have to put those things in place. But what I found out is that in a collaborative governance structure where there's a huge amount of trust, your partners, whatever they represent, clinical or administrative, they will actually impose controls on themselves because what's part of motivation is fairness. They want fairness throughout the organization. So if you bring your clinical partners, administrative partners. They actually will start to, they will drive controls that you wouldn't have been able to successfully implement and retain them at the same time otherwise. And so that was been one thing I've been interested to find is that there's lots of different ways to look at governance of organizations. There's corporate governance, there's collaborative governance, which generally comes from like public administration and some other aspect. They're starting to apply it to some healthcare. But from the organizational behavior side of things, they actually are more focused on trust-based governance, control-based governance, kind of these broader underlying principles than kind of like really more of a framework. And so and the answer really is that it's both. Like when there's a high level of trust, actually controls begin to be put in place organically because people want fairness. But they're collaborative. They know that as you scale, there has to be some sort of framework. So there's freedom in the framework. And if the framework is created in collaboration with your partners, whoever they might be, then I think your chances of success are higher. And I think that framework addresses future collaboration and how to manage any breaches of trust or the psychological contract, or and how to repair those things. And you have definitions to kind of your vision of like, hey, this is what autonomy means. This is what, this is what financial success means. Because one of the things like, hey, we want sustainable growth. Well, like, what does that mean? And because what that means to a private equity partner and to someone else might be different. And so we have to define that, making sure all your partners and your partners are your PE, they're your clinical, they're your team, executive team. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but
that's great.
That's how you got to do it. Is that controls? I've seen that you put doctors in the room and say, hey, here's the challenge of the organization. How do you propose we do it? It isn't let everybody go do whatever they want. They'll be like, well, I think we all need to be doing this, or I'm doing this. I think everybody should be doing this. And all of a sudden, like organically kind of some framework and controls get put in place. And it doesn't mean they all 100% agree, but, we try to get super majority at least. and generally the super majority are those who are probably at or striving for kind of like top 10%, individual type production as well as practice production. So there is a framework. There's some interesting things there too.
Yeah. So in 2023, you guys brought on some private equity, right? What was kind of what were the kind of the events that led up to you feeling like, hey, this is the right time to bring in a private equity partner, and how was that experience for you?
I mean, I think that in a lot of ways it was what a lot of people might expect it to be. In a lot of ways it wasn't. For us, our motivating factor, we never make a decision on any one thing. So it was just an accumulation over time of, hey, we think that this might be the appropriate time to kind of look for a minority partner. We didn't run a process, which pretty much everyone told us not to do that, not to run a process, and we did it anyway. So, and so I don't know what I would recommend, post transaction, like if I would say, hey, you should run a process or not. I would say that if you really understand the business and so forth, I think it's manageable. I think that in some ways I felt like, we ended up in a good place. And from what I understood about the market and due diligence that I had done and some of the relationships I've had over the years, I would say the benefit of maybe running a process, if you want to run a process purely to maximize the value, I don't know that that's, maybe the running reason. I think the benefit to us would have been a buffer between us and our future partner. And so when you're negotiating directly, then the next day you have to be friends and you got to go try to grow the business. That can potentially provide a future barrier if you're not careful. I'm not saying that that's exactly what happened with us, but I would say that, for us, it took longer and it cost more money than we thought, and even what, was portrayed to us. But I think in the end, we're happy with our partnership with Clairvest Group. They're a great, minority investor. They put a significant amount of capital in their investments from the partners. I think it's over 30%, but somewhere in that range where a lot of private equity might, put in like single digits, of their own money. But this is the Clairvest team, those partners putting money alongside their institutional investors. So they're very engaged. It's not them just making money for others or losing money for others. It's their own investment. So I think you kind of feel that in the relationships. I think they've been great. I've met their CEO and met with several other CEOs. They do an annual meeting, and so I think it's been good. I think the timing was good and bad for the organization, just from coming out of COVID. I think that we had made some acquisitions at the top of the market. I think maybe they could potentially feel like they made an acquisition at the top of the market too.
Yeah.
And so now we're both kind of, I'm trying to come to that realization with the acquisitions we made with our dental partners. They're probably trying to come to the realization, of that with their investment. And, but I think that it's taken us a little bit of time to get there. But I think as we've kind of said, all right, we understand that, that there was a timing, and then there's a current economic, environment that we're working through. But overall, it's not like we've not grown. I think that we just hadn't been growing at 30% like we did for 12 or 13 years in a row. But I think we're poised to kind of get back, on that track, and we have a lot of internal opportunities that we can go after. So yeah, it's been good. Some of the other motivating factors for us is, we had some aging significant partners, that wanted to exit the organization. And so we needed to find a mechanism to kind of start that process. But we chose to do a minority, and we searched out some people we knew did minority deals, and Clairvest was one of the few that did it in such a way where their aim wasn't for you to become, a minority partner prior to the transaction. So they traditionally had held their same interest throughout the period. And they also have an investment in Abra, which is an East Coast dental group that they've had 3 or 4 years before us, and it's done very well in pediatrics and orthodontics. And so, yeah, it's been good. And I think that the environment has not made it as good as we hoped it would be, as quickly as we hoped it would be. But I also chose them because they had kind of a longer outlook and a longer hold period. And so we feel like we can, get back on track. And then their growth expectations were the same really as ours have been. Like we grew for 12, 13 years without anybody, and we grew at a fairly good clip. So none of what they wanted to do scared us. And so I think that it was a good fit. Timing was been a little rough, I think, for everybody, but I think the relationship is good, and we're optimistic on the future, and it's given us time to make sure we have continue to improve and evolve the governance structure of the organization and make sure we have strong future alignment. We've relooked at the economics of our group from an alignment point of view in order to make sure that we have more consistency, in the organization long term. And so, it's been good.
That's great. Well, last question here. If you could go back to 2011, and what would you do differently, if anything? I don't want to give you the easy out of anything. What would you do differently?
What would I do differently? That's a difficult question, because with the knowledge I had at the time, with that caveat, I'm like, I don't know what I could have done differently. With the knowledge I have now, I would have, I thought we did a good job on the governance of the organization, even back then with not knowing anything. But now knowing what I do from not just experience, but some of kind of my academic research, I definitely would have been a bit more descriptive in our governance development and really operationalize that sooner, so that there was more collaboration and more economic alignment at every level, of the organization, so that there was. And so I think that was a huge thing. I think that I would maybe, people told me that going multi-specialty was the hard way, of doing it. And I think that in a perfect world, there's a lot to be said about, Heartland's and Aspen's and Pacific Dental's approach and being very, singular in that purpose. It's just kind of not my nature, but I'm not saying that if I could do it all again, that I might not have been a little bit more focused in terms of where we were acquiring and what we were acquiring and building. I would have spent a little bit more time building out some of our spaces. Our de novo practices ended up being very successful, but then too small. And so, but that's hard because you're bootstrapping it, have all the, so this is if I knew what I knew now and I had, of course, more resources than I had then, these are things that I would do, but I would definitely more focus on collaborative governance and really, focused on economic alignment that I felt could be more long-term, probably retained joint ventures or some form of that a little bit longer. So, I mean, that's, I've asked myself that question a lot, and I feel like we made good decisions with the information we had at the time, and they all had a purpose and reason. And I do think that we got a little extended. We kind of went outside of our areas a little further than a couple decisions that I would have. I'd like to have a few transactions back. And,
a few take backs.
A few take backs. So it'd be nice.
Think we all have one or two of those.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have a lot, but I got a few. So.
Well, Steve, it's been, I mean, like I said, obviously not your and I first time talking. I always leave with just lots of ideas and just your. I love your leadership style. I actually quote you a lot. One of the first things I heard you say, and I do give you credit, by the way, is there's always going to be a market for a well-run business, and there's always going to be a market. It may not always be the price you want, but there's always a market, right? I think that's right. What we're seeing a little bit in our space right now is like, there are buyers, may not be the multiple or the valuation you were hoping for 2 or 3 years ago, but I do love that. I think as leaders, as entrepreneurs, as owners, as CEOs, as founders, as we kind of like look to run our businesses with the same level of, I think, I don't want to call it concern, but just focus that you have around making sure that the providers, not just the providers. I know we talk a lot about providers, but I know you do this for all of your team members, right? Making sure that they feel heard, making sure that they feel valued, making sure that they have that autonomy within the framework, right? I think that's something that I've seen, at least, that you've done very, very well. And so I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your insight and expertise with us. If someone listening to this wanted to learn more about you or learn more about Blutree, where'd be a place they could go to do that?
I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. It's just steve@BlueTreeDental.com, and I'm pretty good about getting back to people. And so, I mean, happy to talk to anybody. We're really kind of concentrated, really in those markets that I've talked about. We're really trying to build them out, but we also within are looking for a strong joint venture relationships that maybe expand just a little bit outside of that marketplace as well. But we have a lot of internal growth, but we are always looking for good partners. And like I said, we got to be running good businesses. Good businesses will always be, valuable, provided that the risk is low and there's steady growth, right? That's all. We want to make investments in growth with low risk, right? So
awesome. Well, Steve, thanks so much for being on here. I guess, next time we talk, I could be calling you Dr. DeLong, it sounds like.
It'll be longer than I probably thought it was going to take, but maybe we'll see. I appreciate all the kind words and you're wonderful. I wish you success and well, I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Likewise. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, take care.
Have a good day.
Yeah,
thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Dental Wealth Multiplier. To make sure you don't miss an episode, go ahead and click the subscribe button. You can also visit us at dentalwealthmultiplier.com to get access to the links or materials mentioned in today's podcast. You can also see other episodes and get access to the most recent reports, tools, and information to continue your wealth building journey.